Okay, hello, biblical history students. I wanted to make a short video for you today to kind of just highlight a couple of things in chapter 6 of Proven's book. Chapter 6 basically talks about, hold on, I should probably get my book so I can reference it. By the way, when you are reading the book when he's talking about these certain things, it would be good to kind of check out the maps at the front of the book. They kind of help you visualize the areas he's talking about. But anyway, this short video is going to be on chapter 6 called Before the Land. It is going to basically be talking about the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, the Exodus account as well. All right, so that is basically what we're going to be covering, what you're going to be reading about in this next chapter. Now again, this is in the book where, given all the theory in the first 5 chapters that Proven has talked about as how you go about assessing history, how do you read the text. You know, you take the text seriously, you take seriously the archaeological evidence that we have, you look at other extra-biblical sources that we may or may not have, and you try to fit them all into a coherent picture of the past. Again, it's not going to be completely certain. You know, absolute certainty is not really possible, but we are looking through windows to the past. The main window is the text itself. Archaeology impacts on how you view things, as well as these other things. So that is what we're going to be talking about. You're going to be reading about in these. Sorry, I'm looking at my notes on my computer. That's what we're going to be looking at right now. All right. When it comes to the patriarchs, obviously the natural question is, where did they come from? The patriarchs take you from Genesis 12 to 50. That's Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Now, as Proven was going to mention, there is no evidence outside the Bible for the existence of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. Of course, that really shouldn't be surprising because back in the ancient world, the only people who were written about were kings and their empires and, their feats as kings. When you read the narrative in Genesis, Abraham was basically a nomadic shepherd guy. Doesn't that sound academic? We shouldn't expect great empires to be writing about, from their perspective, lowly people. So that's one of the first things considered. So is there archaeological evidence for the existence of an Abraham? Well, no. But that, like I said, that shouldn't be surprising. That doesn't mean necessarily that the writing in Genesis is false. It just means it's about a small family. We shouldn't expect an empire to write about a small family in the middle of Canaan. Now, Proven's going to argue that obviously the main purpose of Genesis 12 to 50, the patriarchal narrative, is theological. They're not trying to do objective newspaper history. They're trying to argue that the real one true God somehow involved himself into a relationship with a specific man at a specific time and extended from his family. Therefore, the very writing of the story of Abraham is significantly different than Genesis 1 through 11 or ancient Near Eastern mythological literature as well. Because, let's put it this way, if we were to be objective as possible, when we come to Genesis 12 through 50, regardless of what you think, what may really have happened or not, it's quite clear that it's being presented as actual history. That's when you read Genesis 1 through 12 to 50, it's clear that the writer is telling you that this really happened, as opposed to if you look at other ancient Near Eastern mythological stuff, it's not rooted in history. It's rooted in the realm of the gods. But here it's actually rooted in history. So therefore, for that case, Provin argues it should be Genesis 12 through 50, and a lot of the stuff we're going to be looking at really should be viewed as theological history, because the texts are talking about history and arguing that the one true God is involved in human history somehow. Okay? Again, I'm not going to go through every single question that you're doing. I'm just kind of trying to hit the highlights, and I'll respond to your questions as you do the homework. Also, another thing to consider is, since we're talking about Genesis and the Exodus stuff, this is the Pentateuch, this is the Torah. And Provin does mention, the writer. Traditionally, they've been called the books of Moses. That shouldn't make you think that it's a claim that Moses actually sat down on Mount Sinai and wrote all 5 books. They're associated with Moses because the bulk of them is set during the Exodus, and Moses was the leading figure. But in any case, Provin's point is to try to prove the Mosaic authorship of these first 5 books of the Bible is a fruitless endeavor. You can't prove it, and there's a lot of indication that a single person didn't write it, but that doesn't negate the reliability of the texts themselves. Okay, ultimately it's a fool's errand to get caught up in that argument. Now, when it comes to the time of the patriarchs, we have to talk about timelines. When supposedly did they live? And there's simply no absolute date that scholars agree on. It's because it's foggy. It doesn't give a lot of it claims to be historical, but it doesn't give tons of historical information. So it's a little tougher going with the patriarch stuff. If you were to take the larger narrative picture in the Old Testament, you do get a couple of things. In 1 Kings 6:1, Solomon's temple was built in what would be 966 BC, BCE, whatever you want to call it. And 1 Kings 6:1 said that it began 480 years after the Israelites left Egypt. So if the temple was built in 966, and that was 480 years since they came out of Egypt, you do the math, that would place the date of the Exodus somewhere in the 15th century, roughly 446 BC to 1406. 1446 to 1406 would be, biblically speaking, the time of the Exodus and the wilderness wanderings. Okay, they leave Egypt in 1446. They get to Canaan in 1406. That's what you would get. On top of that, you get in Exodus 12:4, it says that the Hebrews were in Egypt for 430 years. So if they left Egypt in 1446 and they were there for 430 years, that would place the time they came to Egypt in 1876. That would be like Joseph and Jacob's family coming down. And therefore, then, if you put that there, you look in Genesis 21:5, 25:26, Genesis 47:9. Those are the dates of the years of how long the patriarchs lived. You get about 290 years. Therefore, that would place the time of the patriarchs, according to the biblical timeline, somewhere between 2091 to 1867. That would be the time of the patriarchs. Now, the problem is that there is a question regarding whether or not all those numbers are meant to be chronologically exact. Long story short, the 2 main dates, at the very least, most scholars who take the Torah seriously, at least historically to an extent, they place the time of the Exodus, this is the Moses wilderness wandering stuff, either in the 15th century, 1446 to 1406, or in the 13th century, 1246 to 1206, roughly. Again, those numbers are squishy, but generally speaking. When it gets to the Exodus, that's when they generally place it. And therefore, based on one of those, the patriarchs would have lived anywhere between roughly 2100 BC into 1500 BC. That's a 600-year chunk, but that's about as detailed as you're going to get. It's somewhere in that area. There's no way around it. Now, that being said, Provin does talk about a number of extra biblical material, archaeological finds, like the Nuzi tablets, the Mari material. You'll read about them. He mentions that there are certain things in the Genesis narrative that do relate to those other extra biblical sources that line up. For example, when Joseph's brothers sell Joseph as a slave into Egypt, he's sold for 20 shekels. We know that was the going rate at that time period in that area. So that lends credibility to the narrative that it is talking about something that really happened at that time. It lines up. Let's put it this way. If Genesis said that, oh, they sold Joseph to the Egyptians for $200 million, well, we know that, well, they didn't use dollars back then, and $200 million doesn't work because we know the price of a slave, the going rate was 20 shekels. Okay, so it lines up with what we know of that culture at that time. But that being said, there just isn't a lot of archaeological evidence specifically for the actual patriarchs. But again, that doesn't mean that they're just made up fiction. And in fact, when you read through the patriarchal stories, there are societal, cultural clues in the stories that reflect the societal, cultural norms of roughly 2100 to 1500 BC, that area. For example, the patriarchs, they engaged in sexual marital relations that would have been condemned during the nation of Israel. So if they were, so Provin's argument is, if these patriarchal narratives were just made up fiction that were written later on, it would make no sense for the later writers to have as the heads, the origin of their nation, a guy who would be engaging in things that they would then later on find objectionable. So the very fact that Abraham and the patriarchs are doing certain things that were seen as objectionable later on lends credibility that maybe this is actually more in tune with history, actual people. So stuff like that and then the patriarchs engaged in religious practices that the later biblical writers condemned. So again, if they were just making things up later, they wouldn't have included things that they would have found objectionable. And the very fact that the patriarchs do things that are later found objectionable lends credibility that these were real people doing certain things in a time before that. All right. So Provin puts it this way on page 165. I'll give you this quote. How likely is it that much later writers, writing purely out of their own imagination, would paint a picture of their founding fathers that included such things? A good question. So the answer would be probably it wouldn't be likely that they would do that. Okay, so put that all together. There's no archaeological evidence that specifically mentions the patriarchs. There is evidence that shows many of the customs and practices mentioned in Genesis 12 through 50 do reflect that general time period of the ancient Near East. And stuff like that. So that's kind of an interesting thing to consider when you talk about the patriarchs. Another thing that's often brought up during the time of the patriarchs are what they call anachronisms. Certain things mentioned in the patriarchal stories that would not have been known at that time. So, for example, the mention of Ur of the Chaldeans or the city of Dan. Well, the city of Dan, or the mention of the Philistines in the Genesis and Exodus narratives. The city of Dan and the Philistines only came into being later on. So how can you explain them being in this account of an earlier time? Or the mention of camels. We know that camels were not in Canaan during the time of the patriarchs, so why would that be mentioned? That was the general idea. Provin points out that contrary to that idea that camels weren't in the area at the time of the patriarchs, there is indication in an old Babylonian tablet that camels were known among the region. So that's an example of archaeological finds actually giving credibility to that. But as for the mention of Ur and Dan and the Philistines, Provin argues that these are simply instances of the later writers updating the older text with scribal glosses. if they're copying older text for a new audience, that new audience isn't going to be aware of certain things, so the scribe kind of helps them out. So let's say if I was writing a history of the American Indians, and I was using the American Indian locations and whatnot, if you're unfamiliar with it, what I have to do as a writer to update you, I'd have to say, well, this tribe, they lived in like what would have been southern Illinois. Well, obviously, when that tribe was living, southern Illinois wasn't a thing. But for me saying that, it helps you get a mental picture of where certain things were. And so these scribal glosses, as Provin says, with Ur of the Chaldeans, the Philistines, the city of Dan, Provin argues that the later writers are doing that, much like I would be mentioning southern Illinois to help you understand what I was talking about. Okay, bottom line, that doesn't necessarily negate the historical reliability of the text, and it could be understood. Regarding the figure of Abraham, Provin says some interesting things that I'll let you read about. Unfortunately, the typical view is Abraham was just kind of this wandering nomad, but Provin says a close reading of the text shows that the depiction of Abraham in Genesis 12 to 25 isn't of just a wandering nomad, but of a tribal chieftain who he and his people would live outside the cities to tend their flocks, but they would have their own standing army, and they were considered, mighty princes, so to speak. And again, we know from that time period that there were tribal chieftains who didn't live in the cities who did this, and so the description of Abraham fits well with what we know about the time. The figure of Joseph is another interesting thing. On one hand, the story of Joseph, which is Genesis 37 to 50, is as Provin says, a finely crafted piece of literature with subtle theological theme. It's a little novella almost. It's a story for sure. That being said, there are a number of things in the Joseph story that do fit in with what we know was going on in Egypt at that time period, which again lends a little credibility to the story. That's my phone. All right. One of the major things, again, there's a number of things that he talks about, but one of the major things is when you read the Joseph story, there's a whole lot of Egyptian names, which, again, it would be odd if the story was made up hundreds and hundreds of years later during the kingdoms of Israel. It'd be weird that they would use so many Egyptian, they'd be familiar with so many of these Egyptian names. But so therefore the prevalence of references to actual Egyptian names lends credibility to that. One of the things that is often brought up that the Joseph story mentions Pharaoh but never mentions an actual Pharaoh's name, and therefore that somehow hurts the historical credibility of the story. Well, Provin points out that up until the 10th century BCE, it was the common practice never to mention the Pharaoh by name, just Pharaoh. So again, that very thing that you see in Joseph of not mentioning the actual Pharaoh's name bodes well. It fits in with the culture of the time. That's what they did. So there's a lot of interesting things to the Genesis stuff. Now, as far as the Exodus goes, that's a big one. And again, the problem when we read the Exodus accounts is it's inevitable living in the 21st century. When we think of the Exodus, it's like we are conditioned through movies and children's stories to view the Exodus as a certain way. Most people still are at least familiar with the Charlton Heston Ten Commandments movie. And so when we read Exodus, we almost have like a running movie in our head of that or something like that. That picture, Provin argues, isn't necessarily what the text actually portrays. Okay? And there's a lot of interesting things that go along. And so this is the challenge, is to read the text for what the text actually says and not what we think it says because we saw a movie about it and that's what we're thinking in our heads. The biggest problem when it comes to the Exodus that, scholars and historians and archaeologists point out is the site of Mount Sinai and the Red Sea crossing. Where would that be? And one of the things that is clearly true is the traditional site of Mount Sinai. And if you get a map of the Sinai Peninsula, you know, a biblical map, you'll see where the traditional site is. It's in the point of the Sinai Peninsula. That's the traditional site. There's a monastery there. Archaeologists correctly point out that when they skewered that mountain for archaeological finds that would validate the Exodus account, there just isn't anything there. And so therefore, it would be accurate to say that there's no archaeological evidence for that being Mount Sinai. That doesn't mean that the Exodus didn't account. It just means that might not be the right location. And again, there's a lot of other stuff that Provin alludes to, but you can find it. One of the interesting things I'll just point out, it's not necessarily in the book, is that we're told that when Moses flees Egypt initially, he gets outside of Egypt and he goes to Midian. Well, the Sinai Peninsula was still considered Egypt, so it wouldn't make sense for Sinai to be in Egypt, because we're told that he flees to Midian, he lives there for like 40 years, and then he encounters the burning bush. This is Exodus 3, on the mountain of God, which was Horeb or Sinai. Well, it's in Midian, it's not in Egypt. And so the very location of the traditional site doesn't really fit with what the Exodus account actually says. Incidentally, the reason why we have the traditional site where it is because in the 4th century, when Constantine had become a Christian, his mother took a tour of the Holy Land, and when they were traveling through the Sinai Peninsula, she saw this mountain. She said, "Hey, that's Mount Sinai." And everybody said, "Okay." And it's been the traditional site ever since. It's not really an archaeological claim. It was just made by the emperor's mother, which is kind of funny. But in any case, so there's a question of the location of the real Mount Sinai. The traditional Mount Sinai doesn't have archaeological evidence. There are arguments that there is a mountain in what is today modern Saudi Arabia, which was ancient Midian, Jebel al-Lawz, that does have a number of sites on the mountain that, you know, I think, you know, indicates that could have been the location of the real Mount Sinai. But anyway, the next question is that of the Red Sea crossing. And again, logically, you know, when people think of the Red Sea crossing, when they read it, they think of Charlton Heston and like that. Is that the right way to understand what the text is? And this is where we get into understanding what the text is doing. Is the text saying that, like, the massive sea literally spread apart, historically speaking, and that's exactly how it happened? Or is the text doing something else? Before I get to that, though, what Provin talks about is there's a question of where, if the Red Sea crossing happened, where it would happen. And some scholars suggest that it didn't happen down at the tip of the peninsula. It happened up in the salty marsh areas just outside of some of the Egypt's cities. There is a problem with that idea, though, if you think logically, because if you know, read the Exodus story, when Pharaoh finally allows Moses to take the Hebrews out, it's not for good. Pharaoh's not thinking they're going to go away for good. He thinks they're going to go away for 3 days, have a little festival to their God, and then come back. Okay, so you just do the math. Let's say if you're fleeing Egypt, because Moses and the Hebrews, they're leaving for good, but Pharaoh doesn't think they are. Let's say you can go, what, 15, 20 miles a day if you're walking. After 3 days, you're at about 50 miles or so outside of Egypt, but then you keep going. Okay, well, you'd have to assume that Pharaoh probably had spies to, you know, check in on him. Well, once the Hebrews keep going, the spies would have to hoof it back to Egypt for another 2 or 3 days. Pharaoh would have to get his army together to eventually chase after them. The point is, if you do the timeline the way the story of Exodus gives it, by the time Pharaoh would have caught up to them to get to the Red Sea crossing story, they would have been long past the salty marsh areas right outside of Egypt. And so that claim doesn't fit in with what the text says. But anyway, so that leaves us with, some problems of where they went on their journey, where the Red Sea crossing would have happened, where Mount Sinai is. And again, Provin talks a lot about that. And there is a lot of uncertainty. But getting back to the description of the Red Sea crossing, one of the things you have to realize is, and this is where I was an English major, literature major growing up. So I think when I read the text, I see more literary things going on that I think sometimes people miss. And again, this is where history and literature combine. What the Exodus is claiming is that Hebrew slaves left Egypt, fled Egypt, and eventually settled in Canaan. And at some point, they got across the Red Sea. At the bare minimum, that's what it's talking about. Now, what you read in Exodus when it talks about the Red Sea parting and walking across on dry land, and then when Pharaoh comes in, the Red Sea comes in on them and destroys them. What's going on there? Are we to take that as 100% literal description of what happened, or is there some literary artistry going on? I think there is literary artistry going on. I do think it does say that somehow they they escaped, obviously. But the description of the seas parting and walking along on dry land, it has a lot of echoes of the creation story when God parted the sea to bring up dry land on which humanity could live. And the Exodus story really is a creation story about God creating his people. They're taking them out of slavery, and it's the creation of the nation of Israel, basically. And so I think that what the writer is doing when he's talking about the Exodus, he's overlaying the story of the Exodus with a lot of allusions to the creation story. And so what he's describing, I think, is some literary artistry. How they actually got out of Egypt, we don't know for certain, but the story clearly says that they did get out of Egypt somehow. And there's a lot more to it. If you look on, if you get a map of the Sinai Peninsula, the very peninsula, if you get a good map, the very peninsula of Sinai, on the other side, there's Midian, and the land almost comes together on the Gulf of Suez, or is it Aqaba? And there is right on, at that point, there is an underwater land bridge that if low tide happened, it's conceivable they could have crossed. That's all speculation, but there is things there that are worth noting. All right. What else was I going to say about that? Kind of a big overview. Did I talk about that? Oh, yes. No. I'm looking at my stuff. I can't. Oh, yeah. We're going to talk about that. The plagues of Egypt. One of the things we talk about, the plagues of Egypt, how they are depicted. I'll let you read about that, and we'll answer the questions there. But I want to say one more thing. Another key thing the controversial thing is about the numbers during the Exodus. Basically, when you read your English Bibles, it's like in Exodus 12:37 and later on in Numbers 1:46, it talks about the number of people, Hebrews, who left Egypt. It says 600,000 men. Numbers 1:46 basically says 603,550 men besides women and children. Okay? So if you do the math, if that's just the men, roughly the same amount of women and children, it would estimate that there's like 2 million Hebrews leaving Egypt, just traipsing around in the desert for 40 years. That's hard to believe. That's a lot of people just traipsing around the desert. The question, and again, this is where you're reading the text clearly, and Provin points this out. Scholars have noted that the Hebrew word Aleph, and its cognates, which is translated as 1,000 in most English Bibles, can also mean something akin to chieftain or tribe or family. Long story short, instead of, if you understand the translational question, if that Aleph means clan or tribe, or like clan or family, instead of 2 million people, it would come out to be about 50,000 people, some estimates down to 20,000 people. It would be more like 603 families plus 550 military captains. Basically, that's how some translations could take it. And if you do that, that would take the overall population number of the Exodus not to 2 million, but to roughly 20,000, which would, be a lot more believable. A group of slaves in Egypt escaping that way. But again, is it speculation? Yes. But there are textual questions about translation, literary artistry. This is where we get into, like Provin has talking in the first 5 chapters, very in general terms. You have to take the text seriously, understand how it is being written, look at the archaeological evidence or lack thereof, look at, in this case, the geography, come to the conclusion you best can get at. But the point is, with all of this, as he's going to talk about, is there's a lot of stuff going on there. You can't just, this is exactly how it happened, maximalist approach, but at the same time, you can't just say, well, that traditional sign of Mount Sinai that's in the Sinai Point, there's no evidence there, therefore it's all wrong. That is equally simplistic. You have to look at all these things and come to your best, view of what had happened. One other thing he mentions, I say this word all the time, either the Hyksos dynasty or the Hyksos dynasty. It's an interesting thing. Historically speaking, we know that there was a Semitic group, the Hyksos, that swept into Egypt around the mid-17th century BC and ruled Egypt for about 100 years. And they give you some of the names there. And it is believed, some scholars believe that when the Hyksos got kicked out in the mid-16th century, around 1550 BC, that could have signaled the time when the Hebrews, who had come in earlier, maybe under the Hyksos dynasty, that's why they were welcomed, it's at that point, that's when they could have possibly been enslaved, which would make sense. When you're in, when a country revolts against a foreign occupier and kicks them out, chances are other people in the country who have not genealogical, ethnic ties to those people, you're going to turn on them and abuse them. It's kind of like what we did in World War II when the Japanese invaded or bombed Pearl Harbor. What did FDR do? Round up all the Japanese and put them in camps. That tends to be a thing that nations do. And so it would make sense, historically speaking, if Jacob and his family had come down to live in Egypt and they were Semitic people, and then right around that time, a Semitic group comes into rule, and then when they were kicked out, the descendants of Joseph would not have been treated well, and that could have explained the slavery. Anyway, he talks about a number of other things that you'll answer, but I just kind of wanted to talk through, hopefully it wasn't too long, some of those bigger issues for you to look at as you read the chapter and to wrestle with. And again, the bottom line is, when it comes to the patriarchs, there isn't a lot of archaeological evidence, but we shouldn't expect that. But there is a lot of things in the narrative accounts that do reflect the culture of the time that we know of. The Exodus account, again, there's not a lot of evidence for that as well, but there are things that you need to consider that makes you shouldn't. There are things to consider that should make you not just dismiss it out of hand all at once. At the same time, you shouldn't read the Exodus account as a written videotape of exactly what happened. There are a lot of things going on there that you have to consider. Okay, hopefully that helps. Enjoy reading. I'll come back with another video at the beginning of next week for basically Joshua and Judges. All right.